Thank you, Carl. I'm going to talk you through all the other things that we have learned yesterday about the outlook for the public finances that were not related to coronavirus. And rest assured, there's more than enough to talk about there as well. First of all, after a year of anxious waiting, we now have a new outlook for growth from the OBR. The OBR has downgraded the overall growth outlook over the whole forecast period compared to what it told us a year ago. However, it has not downgraded us by as much as, for example, the Bank of England did last January in its most recent forecast, especially in the very near term, so this year and next year. This is notable since the bank had already incorporated the stimulus induced by the spending round in 2019, which is included in the package of measures for the OBR, so the OBR does not yet include this in its pre-measures forecast. When we consider the measures included in the budget itself, then we have a sizable short-term boost from a large increase in investment spending, which Ben will tell you a lot more detail about in the next talk. And let's look at this a bit more quantitatively. So in the near term, we've seen a sizable downgrade in the pre-measures forecast. However, the bank was even more pessimistic this year. And when we consider the post-measures forecast, there's this sizable boost from additional investment spending. However, when we consider the middle and the later years of the forecast, things look a little bit different. The boost from investment spending is mainly temporary, so this leads to a front-loading of the growth path. And as this effect unwinds, we are seeing lower growth in the later years of the forecast. The OBR is also rather pessimistic on productivity and highlights that a free trade agreement, even with zero tariffs, would introduce non-tariff barriers that are expected to depress productivity growth over the forecast period as a whole. This leads to a really rather disappointing outlook in the later years of the forecast once the temporary stimulus has dissipated. And it's worth just stressing that in historical comparison, this is really a very, very weak anticipated growth performance. So in this graph, we can see average real growth over the forecast period in a range of spring forecasts since the turn of the century, and it's really very rarely looked so gloomy. What effects might we expect from this depressed growth outlook on the current budget? We are focusing on the current budget deficit in the third year of the forecast, so 2022-23, which is the year that the Chancellor targets with his fiscal target. So just to remind you, the fiscal target set out in the Conservative Manifesto, in which the Chancellor maintained at this budget, is to have a forecast of current budget balance or a surplus in the third year of the forecast. So in 2019, last year we anticipated a 19 billion surplus, and the change in this forecast due to underlying changes in the economy is actually a very small improvement. This may come as a surprise given that the growth outlook has been revised downward. So this small and positive net effect is the result of a combination of much larger and partially offsetting effects. So we are expecting to see lower revenues from this downgrade in growth. So this deteriorates the current budget balance, increases the current budget deficit. Same for spending. This change in the outlook is not as big as we might expect. It's not as big as we're used to from previous revisions. So we're still expecting, as has been the case this year, that revenues will hold up fairly well in the face of a disappointing growth performance. Now, this is more than offset by a really, really large downgrade in the expected debt interest spending. This is driven by two factors: record low interest rates and a very favorable composition of the outlook for inflation, which anticipates a downgrade in RPI, which helps with the cost of servicing the government's debt. And this is how we arrive at this very small improvement in the current budget balance due to underlying economic factors. Now, this is worth taking a step back on and looking at in a little more of a wider perspective. So the debt burden is at a historic high, and nevertheless, debt servicing costs are at a historic low. The debt burden has more than doubled since before the financial crisis. Debt servicing costs as a share of GDP over the same period have actually fallen. The government will need to raise between 135 and 165 billion in each forecast year to fund new borrowing and also to roll over the existing stock of debt. This is about 50% more than before the financial crisis as a share of GDP. Now, successive forecasts have downgraded the government's debt interest spending. For example, for the current year, since the first time we had a forecast for this year, this downgrade has taken us from an expected 60 billion of spending to just 38 billion of spending. And while this is clearly a very favorable development, it's worth being aware that this leaves the public finances quite vulnerable to changes in the outlook for either interest rates or RPI inflation. Now, just to highlight the point about the really quite impressive developments on debt interest spending, these are the different forecast vintages for debt interest spending, and we can see that it has just been continually revised downward and downward and downward. It remains to be seen whether this trend continues ad infinitum. Now, having taken you through the change in the underlying economic environment, what has happened to actual policy measures? So, in the Conservative Manifesto, we already saw some tax-raising measures which improve the current budget balance. These were topped up by some new tax-raising measures in the budget, in total giving us about 8 billion extra room. On the spending side of things, we already knew about a rather sizable increase in current spending from last year's spending round, topped up by a much smaller increase that the manifesto committed to on the current spending side. Of course, the story is much different for investment. On top of this, the budget provided for about another 15 billion of extra current spending. However, about half of this is funded by direct fiscal savings from Brexit. So this is the difference between the contribution we would have made as a member state and the lower payment we make under the financial settlement. In our estimate, the 7 billion is about the same size as the spending that the EU would have made in the UK if we had remained a member. So this is more of a reallocation. We can spend this on other things if we prefer, or we can replace spending that the EU otherwise would have done. It does not really create room for genuinely new spending. This is the case in this particular year, the target year 22-23. As we move further out into the last years of the forecast and beyond into the late 2020s, the net saving will grow as the financial settlement payment eventually drops to nearly zero. And finally, there is a substantial effect from measures in the budget that indirectly improve the current budget balance. This is chiefly due to the boost to growth caused by the large increase in investment spending. Overall, this leaves the Chancellor with 12 billion worth of headroom against his target of current budget balance. It's worth stressing that 12 billion of headroom is not a whole lot. Past forecast errors suggest that this leaves about a 40% chance of ending up running a current budget deficit when the year actually comes around. And there are naturally many sources of uncertainty. We might argue that the growth outlook is particularly uncertain at the moment, not least around the free trade agreement that is eventually struck with the European Union and to replace other free trade agreements with nations around the world, and around the effect of coronavirus, which you've already heard a lot about. To put some sort of a number on this, a downgrade in growth by about 0.3% a year over this 3-year period until the target year comes around would eliminate the headroom. And the fact that I just showed you that debt servicing costs have come down by almost 8 billion in just the past year shows how large these movements can be even within a single year. Borrowing is no longer directly targeted by the new set of fiscal targets, but let's still have a look at it. Compared to the 2019 restated forecast, the pre-measures new forecast does not look that different. However, if we consider the current forecast, including the new measures that we saw in the budget, then borrowing is projected to rise much more. And to give you a sense of comparison, it is projected to be above its long-run pre-crisis average in every year of the forecast, and to come close to the level it was at immediately before the financial crisis. Finally, the Conservative Manifesto included a commitment that debt will be lower at the end of the Parliament. Now, we have stressed before that this is an easy target to meet when we consider headline debt. This is because over this period, the Bank of England is unwinding its term funding scheme that it introduced in the aftermath of the EU referendum. The Bank of England has now announced a new term funding scheme that will help small and medium businesses to cope with the impact of coronavirus. We don't have many details about that yet, but the illustrative impact of that scheme could look something like this. So this would delay the fall even in the headline debt burden. And if we think of this commitment as a commitment that is fundamentally about fiscal policy, then what we really want to do is to consider the debt burden stripping out the Bank of England and its old term funding scheme and its new term funding scheme entirely, and look at the debt burden excluding the Bank of England. On this measure, the debt burden is already expected to slightly rise before accounting for any impact of the coronavirus outbreak. This brings me to my conclusions. The economic outlook presents a mixed picture for the public finances. There has been a downgrade to growth, but the OBR is currently, for the near term, less pessimistic than the Bank of England, again, before coronavirus impacts. And the conditions for debt servicing costs are really very favorable at the moment and help the public finances a lot. The Chancellor is expected to meet his current budget target with a modest amount of headroom. Most of the increases in current spending are either already announced in the 2019 spending round or involve reallocating existing EU spending. Debt excluding the Bank of England is no longer falling, rising gently, and obviously there are many sources of risk and uncertainty around this forecast, particularly around Brexit and around coronavirus, but not limited to these two sources. I will now hand over to Ben Zranko, who will tell you more about the impact on public services.